Welcome to another video on stories of our history. The story of how Islam transformed Persia is not a simple tale of conquest and conversion, but rather one of the most complex and fascinating cultural encounters in human history. When Arab armies emerged from the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century, they encountered the Sassanian Empire, a sophisticated civilization that had ruled the Iranian plateau for over 4 centuries and stood as one of the great powers of late antiquity alongside the Byzantine Empire. The Sassanian dynasty had created an imperial system with elaborate court ceremonies, a powerful Zoroastrian priesthood, an efficient administrative apparatus, and cities such as Ctesiphon that ranked among the largest and most magnificent urban centers in the world. The conquest itself was relatively swift by historical standards, with major battles at Ctesiphon in 636 and Nahavand in 642 breaking Sassanian military power and forcing the young king Yazdegerd III to flee eastward until his death in 651 brought the dynasty to an end. Yet the disappearance of the imperial structure did not mean the disappearance of the Persian people, their institutions, or their cultural memory. And it is precisely this continuity amid profound change that makes the Islamic assimilation of Persia such a remarkable historical phenomenon. The Persian soul, shaped by millennia of civilization stretching back to the Achaemenid Empire of Cyrus the Great and Darius, would prove remarkably resilient, adapting to new religious and political realities while preserving something essential about Iranian identity that would eventually transform the Islamic world itself. The Arab conquerors who established control over the Iranian plateau were initially a small ruling minority, vastly outnumbered by the populations they governed and lacking the administrative experience necessary to manage such a vast and complex territory. The Sassanian bureaucracy had developed sophisticated methods for collecting taxes, maintaining irrigation systems, organizing urban life, and keeping detailed records. And the new rulers quickly discovered that they could not govern without the cooperation of Persian officials who understood these systems intimately. Persian scribes, tax collectors, and administrators continued their work under Arab supervision, now writing documents in Arabic but applying techniques and organizational principles that had been refined over centuries of Sassanian rule. This practical necessity created an early channel through which Persian administrative wisdom flowed into the emerging Islamic state, shaping everything from fiscal policy to the organization of provincial government. The Umayyad Caliphate, which ruled the Islamic world from Damascus between 661 and 750, relied heavily on these Persian administrators even as it maintained Arab political dominance, creating a situation in which Persians were simultaneously subordinate in political terms yet indispensable in practical terms. This paradox of political subordination combined with administrative centrality would characterize the Persian position within early Islamic society, and would eventually provide the foundation for a dramatic reversal of cultural influence. The religious transformation of Iran proceeded even more slowly than the political conquest, contrary to what one might assume from the eventual dominance of Islam in the region. During the first century after the conquest, conversion to Islam among the Iranian population was relatively limited, with most Persians remaining Zoroastrian while paying the jizya tax required of non-Muslims under Islamic law. The Zoroastrian religion, which had been the state faith of the Sassanian Empire and traced its origins to the prophet Zarathustra perhaps a millennium or more earlier, continued to function among the population, though it had lost the imperial patronage that had once supported its temples and priesthood. Archaeological evidence and literary sources suggest that fire temples continued to operate in many parts of Iran during the Umayyad period, and Zoroastrian communities maintained their rituals and traditions despite their new political circumstances. The slow pace of conversion during this early period reflected both the resilience of Zoroastrian institutions and the initial reluctance of Arab rulers to encourage mass conversion, since non-Muslims provided important tax revenue through the jizya that Muslim converts would no longer pay. This fiscal incentive created a complex dynamic in which the state sometimes discouraged conversion even as the social and political advantages of belonging to the Muslim community became increasingly apparent to subject populations. The geography of conversion across the Iranian world reveals important patterns that help explain how and why Islam gradually became the dominant faith of the region. Urban centers and commercial cities, where Arab garrisons were stationed and where daily contact between Muslims and non-Muslims was most intense, tended to see earlier conversion than remote rural areas, mountainous regions, and frontier zones where Zoroastrian communities could maintain their traditions with less interference. Cities such as Isfahan, Shiraz, and Hamadan became centers of Islamic learning and culture relatively quickly, while regions like Yazd, Kerman, and the Caspian coast retained significant Zoroastrian populations for many centuries. The eastern provinces of Khorasan and Transoxiana, which had been important centers of Sassanian culture, developed distinctive patterns of Islamic practice that incorporated Persian elements while also becoming centers of resistance to Arab political domination. This regional variation demonstrates that the Islamization of Persia was never a uniform process but rather a patchwork of local accommodations, negotiated conversions, and persistent traditions that varied dramatically from place to place. The survival of Zoroastrian communities in Iran into the present day, particularly in Yazd and Kerman, is a testament to the incompleteness and gradualism of this religious transformation. The mechanisms of conversion themselves were multiple and complex, involving far more than simple force or political pressure, though these elements certainly played roles in certain times and places. For many Persians, conversion to Islam offered practical advantages: escape from the jizya tax, access to positions in the administration and military, integration into commercial networks dominated by Muslims, and social prestige associated with the ruling faith. Intermarriage between Arab settlers and Persian women created families in which children were raised as Muslims, gradually expanding the Muslim population through demographic processes rather than individual adult conversions alone. The patronage of local elites could bring entire communities into the Muslim fold, as influential landowners and tribal leaders who converted for political reasons were often followed by their dependents and clients. At the same time, genuine religious conviction played an important role, as the monotheistic message of Islam resonated with Persians who had been exposed to Zoroastrian dualism and found something compelling in the simplicity and clarity of Islamic theology. The emergence of Persian converts who became scholars, jurists, and theologians demonstrates that conversion was not merely a matter of convenience but could involve deep intellectual and spiritual engagement with the new faith. The Abbasid Revolution of 750, which overthrew the Umayyad Caliphate and established a new dynasty based in Iraq, marked a turning point in the relationship between Persians and Islam that would have profound consequences for both. The Abbasid movement had drawn substantial support from Persian converts, particularly in Khorasan, who resented Umayyad policies that seemed to favor Arabs regardless of their piety or competence. When the Abbasids came to power, they established their capital at Baghdad, close to the old Sassanian capital of Ctesiphon, and adopted administrative practices and court ceremonies that drew heavily on Persian models. Persian advisors, administrators, and scholars acquired unprecedented influence at the Abbasid court, and the conversion of the Iranian population accelerated dramatically during the 8th and 9th centuries. By around 950, according to some estimates, perhaps 80% or more of Iranians had become Muslims, though Zoroastrian communities persisted in certain regions and would continue to do so for centuries. The Abbasid period thus represents the critical phase in which Persia became an integral part of the Islamic world while simultaneously imprinting its own cultural patterns onto that world in ways that would prove enduring. The fall of the Sassanian Empire did not mean the end of Persian culture, institutions, or social structures, despite the dramatic political rupture that accompanied the Arab conquest. When Ctesiphon, the magnificent Sassanian capital on the banks of the Tigris River, fell to Arab forces in 637, the imperial treasury, court, and administrative center were captured, but the vast majority of the Persian population continued to live in their cities, villages, and provinces much as they had before. The Sassanian Empire had been a complex bureaucratic state with multiple layers of administration, from the central ministries at the capital to provincial governors, district officials, and local tax collectors who maintained detailed records of land ownership, crop yields, and population. This administrative machinery did not simply vanish with the fall of the dynasty. Instead, it was adapted by the new Arab rulers who recognized that they lacked the expertise to manage such a sophisticated system on their own. Persian secretaries and scribes, known as dabiran, continued to perform essential functions such as registering property, calculating taxes, maintaining correspondence, and organizing the flow of information that any government requires to function effectively. The Sassanian practice of using written documents for all official business was adopted by the Islamic State, creating a tradition of bureaucratic documentation that would characterize Islamic administration for centuries. The continuity of Persian administrative practices under Islamic rule was not merely a matter of convenience but represented a fundamental transfer of governmental knowledge from one civilization to another. The Sassanian system of land taxation, which was based on detailed cadastral surveys that recorded the extent and productivity of agricultural land, provided a model that Islamic rulers adapted to their own needs. The concept of the diwan, a register or office for keeping accounts and records, entered Islamic administration from Persian practice and became a fundamental institution of Islamic government. The Arabic word diwan itself is of Persian origin, derived from the Middle Persian term for a collection of writings or documents, and its adoption into Arabic administrative vocabulary demonstrates the degree to which Persian organizational concepts shaped the emerging Islamic state. Persian tax collectors and accountants continued to work in the provinces after the conquest, now serving Arab governors but applying the same techniques and standards they had used under the Sassanians. This continuity of personnel meant that the transition from Sassanian to Islamic rule was far less disruptive at the local level than the dramatic events at the imperial center might suggest, allowing Persian society to adapt gradually to its new political circumstances. The role of Persian elites in the early Islamic state was complex and often contradictory, involving both subordination and influence in different spheres of activity. The Daikans, a class of local landowners and minor nobility who had formed the backbone of Sassanian provincial administration, often reached accommodations with Arab rulers that preserved their lands and status in exchange for cooperation in tax collection and local governance. These Daikans served as intermediaries between the Arab authorities and the Persian population, translating official decrees, organizing labor, and ensuring that taxes were collected efficiently. Some Daikans converted to Islam and integrated themselves into the new ruling class, while others remained Zoroastrian for generations while still serving the Islamic state in administrative capacities. The persistence of this class of Persian notables through the conquest period and beyond demonstrates that the Arab victory did not result in the wholesale replacement of Persian elites, but rather their gradual absorption into new structures of power. This process of elite accommodation would have profound consequences for the development of Islamic civilization, as Persian families with traditions of learning and administration brought their expertise into the service of the new faith. The fiscal policies of the early Islamic state played a crucial role in shaping the relationship between Arab rulers and Persian subjects, creating incentives and pressures that would eventually contribute to widespread conversion. Under Islamic law, non-Muslims living under Muslim rule, known as dhimmis, were required to pay a special tax called the jizya, which was levied on individual adult males and was associated with the protection provided by the Islamic State and exemption from military service. In addition to the jizya, non-Muslim landowners paid a land tax called the kharaj, which was also paid by Muslims in some interpretations but was often heavier for non-Muslims. These taxes provided essential revenue for the Islamic State, which used them to fund military campaigns, build infrastructure, and support the growing administrative apparatus. The fiscal burden on non-Muslims varied over time and by region, but in periods when the state faced financial difficulties or when particular governors were especially zealous in collecting revenue, the pressure on Zoroastrian communities could become severe. This fiscal pressure undoubtedly contributed to conversion, as becoming a Muslim could reduce or eliminate certain tax obligations while opening access to the privileges of membership in the ruling community. Beyond the purely fiscal incentives, the social and political advantages of conversion to Islam became increasingly apparent to Persians as the Islamic State consolidated its control over the Iranian plateau. Muslims enjoyed preferential treatment in legal matters, access to government positions, and the prestige of belonging to the community of believers that was now dominant throughout the region. The Arabic language, as the language of administration and religion, became essential for anyone seeking advancement in the new order, and learning Arabic necessarily involved exposure to Islamic religious concepts and texts. Persian merchants who converted to Islam could participate more fully in the expanding commercial networks that connected the Islamic world from Spain to Central Asia, benefiting from the trust and cooperation that shared faith facilitated among traders. Military service offered another path to advancement for converts, as the early Islamic armies were open to non-Arab Muslims who demonstrated loyalty and skill, and successful military careers could lead to land grants, salaries, and social prestige. These varied incentives created a cumulative pressure toward conversion that operated gradually over generations, transforming the religious demography of Iran through countless individual decisions made in response to changing circumstances. The conversion of Persians to Islam was further facilitated by the universalistic message of the new faith, which offered a religious identity that transcended ethnic and tribal distinctions and promised spiritual equality to all believers regardless of their origins. Islam's emphasis on the oneness of God, the importance of moral conduct, and the coming day of judgment resonated with Persian religious sensibilities shaped by Zoroastrian concepts of cosmic struggle between good and evil and individual accountability for one's actions. The Quran's denunciation of idolatry and its call to worship the one true God could appeal to Zoroastrians who already practiced a form of monotheism, or at least henotheism, in their devotion to Ahura Mazda as the supreme deity. The Islamic emphasis on prayer, charity, fasting, and pilgrimage provided a structured framework for religious practice that could replace the elaborate rituals of Zoroastrianism while satisfying the human need for regular spiritual discipline. Persian converts who embraced Islam with genuine conviction often became among its most zealous advocates, bringing to their new faith the same devotion and intellectual rigor that had characterized Zoroastrian religious culture for centuries. This genuine religious transformation, as much as any material incentives, explains the eventual thoroughness of Iran's conversion to Islam. The gradual conversion of the Iranian population to Islam occurred over several centuries, with the pace of conversion varying dramatically by region, social class, and historical period. During the Umayyad period from 661 to 750, conversion among Persians was relatively slow, and Zoroastrians remained the majority of the population in most regions of the former Sassanian Empire. The Umayyad caliphs, ruling from Damascus, generally maintained the fiscal distinction between Muslim and non-Muslim subjects, and showed little enthusiasm for mass conversion that would reduce tax revenues. Arab settlers in Iran remained largely separate from the Persian population, concentrated in garrison cities and military camps, and intermarriage between Arabs and Persians was relatively limited during this early period. The Zoroastrian priesthood continued to function, fire temples remained open, and the religious life of Persian communities proceeded much as it had before the conquest, though without the imperial patronage that had once supported the faith. This early period of relative religious stability allowed Persian society to adjust to Islamic political rule without immediately abandoning its traditional religious identity, creating conditions for a more gradual and organic process of conversion in later centuries. The Abbasid Revolution of 750 transformed the religious landscape of Iran by bringing to power a dynasty that actively sought the support of Persian converts and adopted policies that encouraged conversion. The Abbasids themselves had deep roots in Khorasan, the eastern province of the former Sassanian Empire that had become an important center of Islamic settlement and conversion, and their rise to power was made possible by the support of Persian Muslims who had been marginalized by Umayyad policies. Once in power, the Abbasids moved the capital from Damascus to Baghdad in 762, establishing their court in the heart of the old Sassanian territory and surrounding themselves with Persian advisors and administrators. The Abbasid caliphs presented themselves as rulers of all Muslims regardless of ethnic origin, and the distinction between Arab and non-Arab Muslims gradually lost its political significance as Persians rose to positions of power and influence. This new political environment removed many of the barriers that had discouraged conversion during the Umayyad period and created strong incentives for Persians to embrace Islam as a path to advancement and integration into the ruling community. The pace of conversion accelerated dramatically during the 8th and 9th centuries, as evidenced by genealogical records, biographical dictionaries, and historical chronicles that document the religious affiliations of prominent families over multiple generations. Scholars who have studied these sources estimate that perhaps 10% of Iranians had converted to Islam by the end of the Umayyad period in 750, a figure that reflects the slow start of the conversion process in the first century after the conquest. By the year 800, this proportion may have risen to 30 or 40%, reflecting the impact of Abbasid policies and the growing social pressure toward conversion. By around 950, most estimates suggest that 80% or more of Iranians were Muslims, with Zoroastrians reduced to a minority concentrated in particular regions and social niches. These figures, while necessarily approximate, demonstrate that the conversion of Iran was a long-term process that accelerated significantly in the Abbasid period but took several centuries to reach completion. The transformation was gradual enough that each generation experienced only modest changes in the religious composition of their communities, yet cumulative enough that the Iran of 950 was fundamentally different from the Iran of 750. The conversion process was not uniform across Iranian society, and different regions and social groups adopted Islam at different times and for different reasons. Urban populations, who had the most contact with Arab settlers and the greatest incentives to convert, generally became Muslim earlier than rural populations who could maintain their traditional practices with less interference. The cities of western Iran, such as Hamadan, Isfahan, and Ray, became Muslim relatively quickly, while the eastern regions of Khorasan and Transoxiana developed distinctive patterns of conversion influenced by their distance from the caliphal center and their role in the Abbasid Revolution. Mountainous areas and remote valleys, where Arab control was weakest and Zoroastrian communities could practice their religion with minimal interference, retained their traditional faith for centuries longer than the plains and trade routes that were more closely integrated into the Islamic state. The Caspian coast, protected by the Alborz Mountains, remained a stronghold of Zoroastrianism and local Iranian culture long after the rest of Iran had converted, as did parts of Fars province and the region around Yazd in central Iran. These regional variations created a patchwork of religious communities that persisted for centuries and in some cases, particularly in Yazd and Kerman, continued to the present day. Social class also played an important role in determining the pace and pattern of conversion, with elites and urban professionals generally converting earlier than peasants and rural laborers. The daikans, the minor nobility who served as local administrators and tax collectors, often converted relatively early to preserve their positions and status under the new regime, though many remained Zoroastrian for generations while continuing to serve the state. Merchants and artisans in the cities, who benefited from participation in Islamic commercial networks and from the social connections that conversion provided, also converted relatively early. The peasantry, who had less contact with the ruling elite and less to gain from conversion, often remained Zoroastrian longer, particularly in areas where the local daikin continued to follow the old faith and provided an example of resistance to conversion. This class dimension of conversion created a situation in which the religious transformation of Iran was also a social transformation, as the patterns of conversion reflected and reinforced changing relationships between different segments of Iranian society and the new Islamic state that governed them. The motivations for conversion were complex and varied, combining material incentives, social pressures, and genuine religious conviction in ways that differed for each individual and community. Some converts were attracted by the simplicity and clarity of Islamic monotheism, finding in the Quran's message of submission to the one God a compelling alternative to the elaborate cosmology and ritual of Zoroastrianism. Others were drawn to Islam through personal relationships, converting upon marriage to a Muslim spouse or through the influence of Muslim friends, colleagues, or patrons. Many converts were motivated primarily by practical considerations, seeking to escape the jizya tax, gain access to government employment, or improve their social standing within the new political order. The relative importance of these different motivations varied over time and by region, with religious conviction becoming more significant as Islamic institutions became more deeply rooted in Iranian society, and as generations grew up surrounded by Muslim culture. The cumulative effect of these countless individual decisions was the gradual transformation of Iran from a predominantly Zoroastrian society to a predominantly Muslim one, a transformation that occurred not through dramatic moments of mass conversion but through the slow accumulation of individual choices over many generations. The survival and adaptation of Zoroastrianism after the Arab conquest represents one of the most remarkable stories of religious endurance in world history, demonstrating that the Islamization of Iran was far from complete or immediate. Zoroastrianism, which traced its origins to the prophet Zarathustra and had served as the state religion of the Sassanian Empire, lost its imperial patron with the fall of the dynasty but did not disappear from the religious landscape of Iran. The Zoroastrian priesthood, which had been organized in a hierarchical structure with the Mabadan Mobad, or chief priest, at its head, lost its official status but continued to serve the religious needs of communities throughout the Iranian plateau. Fire temples, which had been supported by royal patronage and aristocratic endowments, faced difficult circumstances as their sources of funding diminished, but many continued to operate with support from local communities. The religious calendar, with its festivals such as Nowruz and Marigan, continued to mark the passage of the year for Zoroastrian communities, preserving a sense of cultural and religious continuity even as the political world around them changed. This continuity of religious practice demonstrates that the Arab conquest, while politically decisive, did not immediately overturn the religious life of the Iranian people. The relationship between Muslim rulers and Zoroastrian communities varied considerably over time and by region, ranging from relatively tolerant coexistence to active persecution depending on the policies of particular caliphs and governors. In the early decades after the conquest, Arab rulers generally adopted a pragmatic approach, recognizing that the Zoroastrian population was too numerous to convert by force, and that the jizya tax provided valuable revenue for the Islamic State. Local agreements between Arab commanders and Persian communities often specified the terms under which Zoroastrians would live under Muslim rule, including guarantees of religious freedom in exchange for payment of taxes and acceptance of Islamic political authority. These agreements, while not always honored, established a framework within which Zoroastrian communities could continue to practice their religion with a degree of legal protection. The status of Zoroastrians as dhimmis, protected non-Muslims under Islamic law, gave them certain rights and responsibilities that were defined in Islamic jurisprudence, though the application of these principles varied widely in practice. This legal framework, while clearly subordinate to Muslim status, provided a basis for Zoroastrian survival that had not existed for all conquered peoples in all historical contexts. The pressure on Zoroastrian communities increased significantly during the Abbasid period, particularly from the late 8th century onward, as Islamic rulers adopted more aggressive policies toward non-Muslim populations. The Abbasid caliphs, who had come to power with the support of Persian converts and who presented themselves as champions of Orthodox Islam, showed less tolerance for Zoroastrian practices than their Umayyad predecessors had generally done. Fire temples were destroyed or converted into mosques in some regions, particularly in areas where the Zoroastrian presence was seen as a challenge to Islamic authority, or where local governors sought to demonstrate their zeal for the faith. The jizya tax was sometimes collected with harsh methods that effectively forced conversion upon those who could not pay, and Zoroastrians faced increasing restrictions on their public religious activities. The priesthood, deprived of its former status and resources, struggled to maintain the training of new priests and the transmission of religious texts, leading to a gradual decline in the institutional strength of Zoroastrianism. This period of increased pressure, while not constituting a systematic campaign of forced conversion, nevertheless accelerated the decline of Zoroastrianism and pushed many communities toward Islam. Despite these pressures, Zoroastrian communities persisted in many parts of Iran throughout the medieval period and beyond, demonstrating remarkable resilience in the face of difficult circumstances. The region of Yazd in central Iran became a major center of Zoroastrian survival, protected by its remote location and the determination of its inhabitants to maintain their traditional faith. Kerman, in southeastern Iran, similarly maintained a significant Zoroastrian population for centuries after the conquest, as did parts of Fars province, the historic homeland of the Sassanian dynasty. The Caspian coast, isolated by the Alborz Mountains, preserved Zoroastrian and other pre-Islamic Iranian traditions long after they had disappeared from more accessible regions. These communities maintained their fire temples, trained their priests, and passed on their religious texts through oral tradition and manuscript copying, ensuring the survival of Zoroastrian knowledge even as the religion's institutional infrastructure weakened. The persistence of these communities demonstrates that the Islamization of Iran, while ultimately successful in converting the majority of the population, was never total, and that Zoroastrian identity remained a living reality for many Iranians throughout the Islamic period. The migration of Zoroastrians to India, where they became known as Parsis, represents another important dimension of Zoroastrian survival that extended the religion beyond the borders of Iran. Beginning in the 8th century and continuing in waves over subsequent centuries, groups of Zoroastrians fled persecution in Iran and settled in Gujarat, on the western coast of India, where they established communities that preserved their religious traditions. The Parsis maintained their fire temples, trained their priests, and transmitted their sacred texts in India, creating a center of Zoroastrian life that complemented the communities remaining in Iran. The relationship between the Parsi community in India and the Zoroastrian communities in Iran was maintained through correspondence, pilgrimage, and the exchange of religious knowledge, ensuring that neither community was completely isolated from the other. The Parsi experience demonstrates that the Islamization of Iran paradoxically contributed to the spread of Zoroastrianism beyond its homeland, as the pressures that converted most Iranians to Islam also drove some Zoroastrians to seek refuge elsewhere. Today, the Parsi community in India represents one of the most important surviving centers of Zoroastrian religion and culture, a living link to the pre-Islamic Persian past. The transformation of Zoroastrianism from a state religion supported by imperial patronage to a minority faith maintained by scattered communities represents a fundamental change in the religion's character and institutions. Without the support of the Sassanian state, the Zoroastrian priesthood lost its hierarchical organization and its ability to enforce orthodoxy across the entire Iranian world. Individual communities became more autonomous in their religious practice, leading to regional variations in ritual and doctrine that would not have been possible under the centralized Sassanian system. The transmission of religious knowledge became more dependent on local priests and family traditions, as the great centers of priestly learning that had flourished under Sassanian patronage declined or disappeared. At the same time, Zoroastrianism adapted to its new circumstances by developing new literary forms, including the Pahlavi texts that were compiled in the 9th and 10th centuries to preserve religious knowledge in the face of Islamic pressure. These texts, written in Middle Persian, codified Zoroastrian theology, ritual, and law in forms that could be transmitted to future generations, ensuring the survival of religious knowledge even as the community itself declined in numbers. This adaptation demonstrates that Zoroastrianism, far from simply disappearing under Islamic rule, actively transformed itself to meet the challenges of its new situation. The relationship between the Persian language and Arabic after the Islamic conquest represents one of the most fascinating examples of cultural interaction in world history, resulting in a transformation of both languages and the emergence of new literary traditions. Arabic, as the language of the Quran and of the Islamic State, became the dominant language of administration, religion, and scholarship throughout the Islamic world, including Iran. Government documents, legal texts, theological treatises, and scientific works were written in Arabic, and mastery of Arabic became essential for anyone seeking advancement in the Islamic State or participation in Islamic intellectual life. The Arabic language absorbed a significant number of Persian loanwords during this period, particularly in the fields of administration, court culture, and daily life, reflecting the influence of Persian officials and the adoption of Persian practices by the Islamic State. Words such as diwan, register, wazir, minister, and various terms for court ceremonies and administrative practices entered Arabic from Persian, demonstrating the practical importance of Persian bureaucratic traditions in the new Islamic order. This linguistic exchange was not one-way, however, as Persian also adopted a vast number of Arabic loanwords and, most significantly, the Arabic alphabet for its written form. The transformation of Persian from its Middle Persian form, written in a variant of the Aramaic alphabet, to New Persian, written in the Arabic script with additional letters for Persian sounds, represents a fundamental change in the language's written expression. Middle Persian, also known as Pahlavi, was the language of the Sassanian court and administration, written in a script that was difficult to read and had many ambiguous characters. The Pahlavi script was intimately associated with the Zoroastrian priesthood and the Sassanian state, and its use declined after the Islamic conquest as Persian administrators shifted to Arabic for official purposes. The emergence of New Persian, written in a modified Arabic script, began in the 8th and 9th centuries as Persian speakers adapted the Arabic alphabet to represent their own language. This new written form of Persian incorporated a large number of Arabic loanwords, particularly in the domains of religion, law, science, and abstract thought, while preserving the basic grammatical structure and core vocabulary of Persian. The result was a language that was simultaneously deeply rooted in Iranian tradition and thoroughly integrated into the Islamic cultural world. The revival of Persian as a literary language began in the 9th century, particularly in the eastern Iranian regions that were ruled by dynasties with strong Persian cultural identities. The Samanid dynasty, which ruled Khorasan and Transoxiana from their capital at Bokhara, played a crucial role in this revival by patronizing Persian poets, scholars, and writers who created the first works of New Persian literature. The Samanid court at Bokhara became a center of Persian cultural production, where poets such as Radaki composed verses in Persian and scholars began to write in the language that had been transformed by contact with Arabic. This literary revival was not a rejection of Islamic culture but rather an integration of Persian language and Islamic civilization, as the New Persian literature drew on both Iranian traditions and Islamic themes. The Samanid rulers, themselves of Iranian descent and proud of their Persian heritage, demonstrated that it was possible to be both Muslim and Persian, and their patronage of Persian literature established a model that would be followed by subsequent dynasties throughout the Islamic world. The development of New Persian literature reached its first great flowering in the 10th century with the work of Ferdowsi, whose epic poem the Shahnameh, or Book of Kings, became the foundational text of Persian literary tradition. Ferdowsi, working from earlier prose and verse accounts of Iranian history and legend, composed a massive epic of some 60,000 couplets that narrated the history of Iran from the mythical first kings to the fall of the Sassanian Empire to the Arabs. The Shahnameh preserved the memory of ancient Iranian heroes such as Rostam, Sohrab, and Esfandiar, and celebrated the virtues of Iranian kingship and nobility in a language that was both distinctly Persian and fully developed as a literary medium. Ferdowsi's work was deeply influenced by Islamic culture, and he was himself a Muslim, but his epic looked back to the pre-Islamic past as a source of pride and identity for the Iranian people. The Shahnameh became the most widely read and influential work of Persian literature, copied and illustrated in countless manuscripts over the centuries and serving as a primary vehicle for the transmission of Iranian cultural memory. Through Ferdowsi's poetry, the pre-Islamic Persian past was preserved and transformed into a literary heritage that could be embraced within an Islamic framework. The relationship between Persian and Arabic in the Islamic world was not one of simple competition or replacement, but rather of complex complementarity, with each language serving different functions in different contexts. Arabic remained the primary language of religious scholarship, law, and theology throughout the Islamic world, including in Iran, where the Quran, Hadith, and works of Islamic jurisprudence were studied in their original Arabic. Persian, meanwhile, became the primary language of literary expression, court culture, and administration in the Eastern Islamic world, serving as a vehicle for poetry, history, and practical governance. The two languages coexisted and influenced each other, with Persian writers frequently using Arabic vocabulary and literary forms while Arabic scholars in Iran often knew Persian and drew on Persian sources for historical and literary material. This linguistic bilingualism created a rich cultural environment in which ideas could flow freely between the two language communities, contributing to the intellectual vitality of Islamic civilization. The emergence of Persian as a major literary language within the Islamic world also created a cultural sphere that extended far beyond Iran, as Persian became the language of high culture throughout much of Asia, from Anatolia to India. The preservation of the Persian language through the Islamic period represents one of the most significant examples of cultural survival in world history, demonstrating that the loss of political independence does not necessarily entail the loss of linguistic identity. Unlike many conquered peoples who adopted the language of their conquerors and lost their own linguistic heritage, the Persians maintained their language while adapting it to new circumstances. The transformation of Persian from Middle Persian to New Persian, with the adoption of the Arabic script and the incorporation of Arabic vocabulary, was not a loss of Persian identity but rather an adaptation that allowed the language to survive and flourish within the Islamic world. The Persian language that emerged from this transformation was in some ways richer than its predecessor, capable of expressing the full range of Islamic religious and intellectual concepts while still preserving the distinctive character of Iranian speech. This linguistic survival ensured that Persian cultural identity would continue to exist within the Islamic world, providing a foundation for the development of a distinctly Persian form of Islamic civilization that would have profound consequences for the history of the entire region. The influence of Persian culture on the Islamic world reached its fullest expression during the Abbasid period, when the Caliphate established its capital at Baghdad in the heart of the former Sassanian territory and surrounded itself with Persian advisors, administrators, and cultural models. The decision of the second Abbasid Caliph, Al-Mansur, to build Baghdad on the Tigris River near the old Sassanian capital of Ctesiphon was deeply symbolic, placing the Islamic Empire in close proximity to the centers of Persian civilization. The design of Baghdad itself, with its circular plan and its elaborate palace complex at the center, drew on Persian architectural traditions and reflected Persian concepts of imperial power and cosmic order. The Abbasid court adopted many Persian ceremonial practices, including elaborate protocols for approaching the caliph, the use of special titles and honors, and the celebration of Persian festivals such as Nowruz. These adoptions transformed the nature of Islamic rulership, moving away from the relatively simple Arab tribal traditions of the Umayyad period toward a more elaborate and hierarchical model of monarchy influenced by Persian imperial precedent. The result was a synthesis of Islamic religious legitimacy and Persian imperial tradition that would shape the political culture of the Islamic world for centuries. The Barmakid family, who served as chief ministers to several Abbasid caliphs in the late 8th century, exemplified the role of Persian elites in shaping the culture and politics of the Abbasid state. The Barmakids traced their ancestry to the hereditary guardians of a Buddhist monastery in Balkh, in present-day Afghanistan, demonstrating the religious diversity of the pre-Islamic Persian world and the ability of Persian families to adapt to changing circumstances. After converting to Islam, the Barmakids rose rapidly through the Abbasid administration, with Khalid ibn Barmak serving as an important advisor to the first Abbasid caliphs and his descendants achieving even greater power. Yahya ibn Khalid al-Barmaki became the tutor and chief advisor to the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, effectively serving as the ruler's most trusted minister, while his sons Fadl and Jafar held high positions in the administration and military. The Barmakids were patrons of learning and culture, supporting the translation of Persian, Greek, and Indian works into Arabic and encouraging the development of Islamic scholarship. Their dramatic fall from power in 803, when Harun al-Rashid had Jafar executed and the family imprisoned, demonstrated the precarious nature of political power in the Abbasid court but did not diminish the lasting impact of their cultural legacy. The Persian influence on Abbasid administration extended to nearly every aspect of government, from the organization of ministries to the methods of tax collection to the protocols of court ceremony. The institution of the wazir, or chief minister, which became central to Abbasid government, had roots in Sassanian administrative practice and was often held by men of Persian descent. The diwan system, with its various registers and offices for managing finances, correspondence, and military affairs, drew heavily on Sassanian models that had been transmitted through Persian officials who served the early Islamic state. The Abbasid postal and intelligence system, which used relay stations and mounted couriers to transmit information across the vast empire, was adapted from Sassanian practice and served as a model for similar systems in later Islamic states. The elaborate court protocol that developed under the Abbasids, with its emphasis on the caliph's seclusion from ordinary people and the strict hierarchy of access to the ruler, reflected Persian concepts of royal dignity that had been unknown in the simpler Arab tribal culture of the early Islamic period. This administrative synthesis created a system of government that was far more sophisticated than anything that had existed in Arabia before Islam, and that would serve as a model for Islamic states throughout the medieval period. The intellectual life of the Abbasid period was profoundly shaped by Persian contributions, as scholars of Persian descent played leading roles in the development of Islamic sciences, philosophy, and literature. The translation movement that brought Greek philosophical and scientific works into Arabic, making them available to Islamic scholars, was supported by Persian patrons and carried out largely by translators of Persian Christian and Muslim background. Persian scholars made major contributions to the development of Islamic astronomy, building on the astronomical traditions of the Sassanian period and incorporating Indian and Greek elements to create a sophisticated science of the heavens. In medicine, Persian physicians drew on the medical knowledge of the Sassanian period, which itself incorporated Greek and Indian traditions, to create comprehensive medical texts that would be used throughout the Islamic world. Persian literature, both in Arabic and in the emerging New Persian, enriched the cultural life of the Abbasid court and provided models for subsequent literary development. The intellectual synthesis achieved in the Abbasid period, in which Persian, Greek, Indian, and Arab traditions were combined into a new Islamic civilization, represented one of the great achievements of human cultural history. The concept of kingship that developed in the Islamic world during the Abbasid period drew heavily on Persian models, adapting the Sassanian ideal of the just ruler to Islamic religious and political circumstances. The Sassanian concept of the king as the guarantor of order, justice, and prosperity, responsible for protecting the weak and maintaining the cosmic balance between good and evil, was transmitted to the Islamic world through Persian advisors and through literary works that celebrated the virtues of ancient Iranian rulers. Khosrow, known as Anushirvan the Just, became a model of wise governance in Islamic literature, celebrated for his justice, his patronage of learning, and his effective administration of the empire. Works of political advice, known as mirrors for princes, drew on Sassanian traditions of governance, and were widely read in the Abbasid period, influencing the way Islamic rulers understood their responsibilities. The Islamic concept of the ruler as the shadow of God on earth, responsible for maintaining justice and protecting religion, incorporated elements of Persian royal ideology while remaining fundamentally Islamic in its theological foundations. This synthesis of Persian and Islamic concepts of rulership created a political culture that would persist throughout the medieval period and beyond. The Persian contribution to Islamic civilization during the Abbasid period was so extensive that some scholars have spoken of a Persianization of Islamic culture, in which the relatively simple Arab tribal traditions of the early Islamic period were transformed by contact with the sophisticated urban civilization of Persia. This transformation was not a replacement of Islamic principles by Persian ones but rather an enrichment of Islamic civilization through the incorporation of Persian cultural forms. The result was a civilization that was genuinely Islamic in its religious foundations and Arabic in its primary language of scholarship, yet thoroughly Persian in its administrative practices, court culture, and concepts of governance. This synthesis created a cultural pattern that would spread throughout the Islamic world, influencing everything from the way rulers governed to the way poets composed verses to the way buildings were designed and decorated. The Abbasid period thus represents the critical phase in the emergence of a distinctive Persian Islamic civilization that would have profound consequences for the subsequent history of the entire region. The political and religious movements that challenged Abbasid authority in the 8th and 9th centuries played a crucial role in the transformation of Iranian society and the development of distinctive forms of Persian Islamic identity. These movements, which combined elements of Islamic ideology with Persian cultural traditions and political grievances, represented attempts by various groups to carve out autonomous spaces within or against the Abbasid state. The success of the Abbasid Revolution itself had demonstrated the potential of movements that mobilized Persian converts against Arab-dominated rule, and this lesson was not lost on subsequent generations of Iranian political and religious leaders. The decades following the Abbasid takeover saw numerous revolts and uprisings in the eastern Iranian regions, where local leaders challenged central authority while claiming various forms of religious and political legitimacy. Some of these movements drew on pre-Islamic Iranian traditions, combining them with Islamic elements to create syncretic ideologies that appealed to populations still in the process of conversion. Others were more straightforwardly Islamic in their ideology but drew on Persian cultural identity as a source of solidarity against Arab or centralizing rule. The complex religious and political landscape of this period demonstrates that the Islamization of Iran was not a smooth or uncontested process, but rather involved significant conflict, experimentation, and negotiation. The movement of Abu Muslim, the Khorasani leader who played a central role in the Abbasid Revolution, illustrates the complex interplay of Persian identity, Islamic ideology, and political ambition in this period. Abu Muslim was a Persian convert who organized the Abbasid movement in Khorasan in the 740s, mobilizing a diverse coalition of groups that shared opposition to Umayyad rule. His success in overthrowing the Umayyads and establishing the Abbasid Caliphate made him enormously popular in Khorasan, where he was seen as a champion of Persian interests against Arab domination. The second Abbasid Caliph, al-Mansur, came to see Abu Muslim as a threat to his authority and had him executed in 755, but the memory of Abu Muslim persisted in Khorasan, where various groups claimed his legacy and sought to continue his mission. Several later revolts in Khorasan were led by figures who claimed to be Abu Muslim or to carry on his message, demonstrating the continuing appeal of his combination of Persian identity and Islamic legitimacy. The story of Abu Muslim illustrates both the possibilities and the limits of Persian political ambition within the Islamic State, as Persians could achieve great power but ultimately remained subject to the authority of the Caliph. The movement of Babak Karamdan, which challenged Abbasid authority in Azerbaijan from 816 to 837, represented a more radical challenge to Islamic orthodoxy that drew on pre-Islamic Iranian religious traditions. Babak led a revolt that combined elements of Zoroastrianism, Mazdakism, and other Iranian religious traditions with a political program of resistance to Abbasid rule and social redistribution. His movement attracted widespread support among the rural population of Azerbaijan and northwestern Iran, who resented the heavy taxation and centralizing policies of the Abbasid state. Babak's followers, known as Kuramites, rejected Arab domination and the orthodox Islam of the Abbasid court, advocating instead a form of religious practice that was deeply rooted in Iranian traditions. The movement posed a serious threat to Abbasid authority for over 2 decades, requiring massive military campaigns to suppress. The eventual defeat and execution of Babak in 837 marked the end of this particular challenge, but the memory of his movement persisted in Iranian cultural memory as an example of resistance to foreign domination. The Kurmite movement demonstrates that the Islamization of Iran was not simply a one-way process of conversion but involved significant resistance and the persistence of alternative religious traditions. The development of Persian dynasties in the Eastern Islamic world during the 9th century represented a new phase in the relationship between Persian identity and Islamic rule. The Tahirid dynasty, founded by Tahir ibn Hussein in 821, established an autonomous Persian state in Khorasan that acknowledged Abbasid suzerainty while exercising practical independence in local affairs. The Tahirids were followed by the Safarid dynasty, founded by Yaqub ibn al-Layth al-Safar in 861, which ruled an even larger territory and was more openly assertive of Persian identity against Arab domination. The Safarid leader Yaqub, who rose from humble origins as a coppersmith to become a military leader, challenged the Abbasid Caliph directly and sought to conquer Baghdad itself, though his campaign was ultimately unsuccessful. These Persian dynasties, while Muslim in religion, asserted a distinctly Persian political identity that drew on pre-Islamic Iranian traditions of kingship and governance. Their courts patronized Persian literature and culture, contributing to the revival of Persian as a literary language. The emergence of these dynasties demonstrated that Persian political identity could find expression within the Islamic world without necessarily challenging Islamic religious authority. The Samanid dynasty, which ruled Khorasan and Transoxiana from 819 to 999, represents the fullest expression of Persian cultural revival within an Islamic framework. The Samanids claimed descent from the Sassanian nobleman Bahram Chobin, establishing a genealogical connection to the pre-Islamic Persian past that legitimized their rule in Iranian terms. Their capital at Bokhara became a major center of Persian culture, where poets, scholars, and artists flourished under Samanid patronage. The Samanid court was conducted in Persian, and the dynasty actively promoted the development of new Persian literature as a medium for expressing Iranian identity within an Islamic context. The poet Radaki, who served at the Samanid court, composed the first major works of new Persian poetry, establishing literary forms that would be developed by later poets. The Samanid period saw the production of important works in Persian prose as well, including historical works that preserved the memory of the pre-Islamic Iranian past. The Samanid achievement demonstrated that it was possible to be both fully Muslim and fully Persian, and their example would be followed by subsequent dynasties throughout the Islamic world. The religious and political movements of the 8th and 9th centuries, taken together, represent a crucial phase in the transformation of Iranian society and the development of Persian Islamic identity. The challenges to Abbasid authority mounted by Abu Muslim, Babak, and others forced the caliphate to accommodate Persian interests and to recognize the importance of the eastern provinces to the stability of the empire. The emergence of Persian dynasties such as the Tahirids, Saffarids, and Samanids created political spaces within which Persian culture could flourish and Persian identity could be expressed in new ways. The syncretic religious movements of this period, combining Islamic and pre-Islamic Iranian elements, represented experimental attempts to create new forms of religious identity that would address the needs of a society in transition. The eventual dominance of Orthodox Sunni Islam in Iran did not erase the memory of these alternative movements, which continued to influence Iranian religious and political culture in subtle ways. The complex religious and political history of this period demonstrates that the Islamization of Iran was not a simple process of conversion from one religion to another but involved significant cultural creativity, political contestation, and the emergence of new forms of identity that were neither simply Persian nor simply Islamic. The development of Sufism in the Iranian world represents one of the most significant contributions of Persian culture to Islamic civilization, creating a form of spirituality that emphasized inner experience, divine love, and the purification of the soul. Sufism, the mystical tradition of Islam, found particularly fertile ground in the Iranian world, where it absorbed elements of Persian cultural sensibility and produced some of the greatest mystical thinkers and poets in Islamic history. The emphasis on spiritual discipline, inner purification, and the cultivation of virtue that characterized Sufism resonated with Persian religious traditions that had long valued ethical conduct and spiritual development. The Persian contribution to Sufism was not simply a continuation of pre-Islamic Iranian religion, but rather a creative synthesis of Islamic mysticism with Persian cultural forms and sensibilities. This synthesis produced a distinctive style of spirituality that would spread throughout the Islamic world and would profoundly influence the religious life of Muslims from Anatolia to India to Southeast Asia. The great Persian Sufi masters of the medieval period developed sophisticated systems of spiritual practice and mystical theology that became foundational for Sufism throughout the Islamic world. Bayezid Bastami, who lived in the 9th century in the city of Batam in northeastern Iran, was one of the earliest and most influential of the Persian Sufi masters. His ecstatic utterances, in which he described his experiences of union with God in terms that shocked more conventional Muslims, became famous throughout the Islamic world and established a model of mystical expression that would be emulated by later Sufis. Abu al-Hasan al-Karakani, who lived in the 10th and 11th centuries, continued this tradition of ecstatic mysticism while also emphasizing the importance of service to others and humility. Abu Said ibn Abi al-Khair, who lived in the 11th century, developed the institutional framework of the Sufi lodge, known as the Kanaka, which became the primary institution for the transmission of Sufi teachings. These early masters established patterns of spiritual practice and teaching that would shape the development of Sufism for centuries. The poetry of Persian Sufism represents one of the highest achievements of Islamic literature, expressing profound spiritual truths in a language of beauty, passion, and symbolic imagery. The poet Jalal al-Din Rumi, who lived in the 13th century and whose family fled from Balkan present-day Afghanistan ahead of the Mongol invasions, became perhaps the greatest mystical poet in world literature. His massive work, the Masnavi, has been called the Quran in Persian and contains thousands of verses exploring the relationship between the human soul and God through stories, parables, and direct spiritual teaching. Rumi's poetry emphasized the power of divine love to transform the human soul, comparing the soul's longing for God to the yearning of separated lovers. The whirling dance of the Mevlevi order, which Rumi founded, became a physical expression of the soul's turning toward God. Rumi's poetry has continued to inspire readers around the world, demonstrating the enduring power of Persian Sufi spirituality. Other Persian Sufi poets, including Attar, Sanai, and Hafiz, also made major contributions to this tradition, creating a body of literature that combines spiritual depth with extraordinary artistic beauty. The Sufi orders that developed in the Iranian world played a crucial role in the spread of Islam and the development of Islamic institutions throughout the region. The orders, known as tariqas, were organized around the teachings of a particular master and his successors, with networks of lodges that provided spiritual guidance, social services, and community organization. The Naqshbandi order, which traced its spiritual lineage through Abu Bakr and emphasized silent remembrance of God, originated in Central Asia and spread throughout the Islamic world. The Qadiri order, founded by Abd al-Qadir al-Jilani, who was of Persian descent, established one of the most widespread Sufi networks in Islamic history. The Chishti order, which developed in India but had Persian roots, became particularly influential in the Indian subcontinent, spreading Islamic teachings through a style of Sufism that emphasized love, music, and service to the poor. These orders played a crucial role in the Islamization of frontier regions, as Sufi masters and their followers established communities that served as centers of Islamic learning and practice in areas where formal Islamic institutions were weak. The Sufi orders also provided a framework for social organization that persisted through periods of political instability, maintaining Islamic institutions even when governments collapsed. The relationship between Sufism and pre-Islamic Iranian religious traditions has been the subject of considerable scholarly debate, with some scholars arguing for significant continuity between Zoroastrian concepts and Persian Sufi ideas. While direct influence is difficult to demonstrate conclusively, there are notable parallels between certain Zoroastrian concepts and Sufi teachings. The Zoroastrian emphasis on the struggle between good and evil, with the individual called upon to choose the side of good, has parallels in the Sufi emphasis on the struggle against the lower self and the cultivation of virtue. The Zoroastrian concept of a cosmic order, known as Asha, which the righteous person must uphold, has echoes in the Sufi emphasis on living in accordance with divine will. The Zoroastrian reverence for light as a symbol of divine presence has parallels in the Sufi use of light imagery to describe spiritual illumination. These parallels do not indicate that Sufism is simply a continuation of Zoroastrianism, but they do suggest that Persian cultural sensibilities shaped the way Sufism developed in the Iranian world. The Persian Sufi tradition, while thoroughly Islamic in its foundations, drew on a cultural heritage that gave it a distinctive character and contributed to its appeal throughout the Eastern Islamic world. The spread of Sufism throughout the Islamic world represents one of the most important channels through which Persian cultural influence extended beyond the borders of Iran. Sufi masters of Persian origin or training carried their teachings to Anatolia, the Indian subcontinent, Central Asia, and beyond, establishing centers of spiritual learning that transmitted Persian language, literature, and cultural values along with Islamic religious teachings. The poetry of Persian Sufis such as Rumi, Hafiz, and Attar became widely known and admired throughout the Islamic world, influencing the development of Turkish, Urdu, and other Islamic literatures. The Sufi orders that originated in the Iranian world established networks that spanned the Islamic world, creating connections between distant regions and facilitating the movement of ideas, people, and goods. This Persian cultural influence through Sufism was particularly important in the spread of Islam to new regions, as Sufi missionaries carried not only Islamic teachings but also Persian cultural forms that enriched the religious and cultural life of the communities they touched. The result was the creation of a Persianate Islamic culture that extended far beyond the borders of Iran and that would have profound consequences for the history of the entire region. The translation movement that flourished in the Abbasid period represents one of the most important intellectual developments in human history, creating a synthesis of Greek, Persian, Indian, and Arab knowledge that would form the foundation of Islamic civilization. The movement, which reached its peak in the 9th and 10th centuries, involved the systematic translation of major works of philosophy, science, and literature from Greek, Syriac, Persian, and Indian sources into Arabic. This monumental undertaking was supported by the Abbasid caliphs, particularly al-Mansur, Harun al-Rashid, and al-Mamun, who saw the acquisition of ancient knowledge as essential to the prestige and power of the Islamic State. The translation movement was also supported by wealthy patrons, including Persian families such as the Barmakids, who understood the value of ancient learning and were willing to invest substantial resources in its preservation and transmission. The result was the creation of an Arabic-language scientific and philosophical literature that built on ancient foundations while making significant original contributions of its own. The Persian contribution to the translation movement was substantial and multifaceted, drawing on the rich intellectual traditions of the Sassanian period and the centuries of cultural exchange between Persia and the Greek, Indian, and Syriac worlds. The Sassanian Empire had maintained centers of learning at Gunshapur, Ctesiphon, and other cities, where scholars had translated Greek and Indian works into Pahlavi and developed their own traditions of medicine, astronomy, and philosophy. After the Islamic conquest, this Persian intellectual heritage was transmitted to the Islamic world through scholars, texts, and institutions that had survived the transition from Sassanian to Islamic rule. Persian Christian communities, such as the Nestorians, played a particularly important role in the translation movement, as they had maintained knowledge of Greek and Syriac and were able to serve as intermediaries between the ancient world and the new Islamic civilization. The Academy of Gunshapur, which had been a major center of medical learning under the Sassanians, continued to function after the conquest and became an important source of medical knowledge for the Islamic world. The family of Bakhtashu, Persian Christian physicians who served the Abbasid caliphs for several generations, exemplified this continuity of Persian intellectual tradition. The development of Islamic medicine was profoundly shaped by Persian contributions, building on the medical traditions of the Sassanian period and incorporating Greek and Indian elements to create a sophisticated system of medical theory and practice. The physicians of the Academy of Gunshapur had developed a comprehensive approach to medicine that combined Greek humoral theory with Indian pharmacological knowledge and Persian clinical practice. This tradition was transmitted to the Islamic world through the Bakhtashu family and other Persian physicians who served at the Abbasid court. The great physician Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi, known in the West as Rhazes, was of Persian origin and made major contributions to the development of Islamic medicine, including the distinction between smallpox and measles, the use of alcohol as an antiseptic, and a comprehensive medical encyclopedia that was used throughout the Islamic world and medieval Europe. Razi's work demonstrates the sophisticated level of medical knowledge that had been achieved in the Islamic world by the 9th and 10th centuries, building on Persian foundations and incorporating Greek and Indian contributions. The medical tradition that developed in the Islamic world through these contributions would remain influential for centuries and would play a crucial role in the development of medicine in medieval Europe. The field of astronomy provides another example of the Persian contribution to the intellectual life of the Islamic world. The Sassanian Empire had maintained astronomical observatories and had developed sophisticated methods for calculating the positions of celestial bodies and predicting astronomical events. This Persian astronomical tradition was transmitted to the Islamic world through scholars who had been trained in Sassanian institutions and through texts that were translated into Arabic. The great astronomer al-Khwarizmi, who was of Persian origin and worked at the Abbasid court in the 9th century, made fundamental contributions to the development of Islamic astronomy and mathematics. His astronomical tables, known as the Zij al-Sindhind, synthesized Persian, Indian, and Greek astronomical knowledge and provided the basis for subsequent Islamic astronomical work. Al-Khwarizmi's contributions to mathematics were even more significant, as his work on algebra and arithmetic introduced new mathematical concepts and methods that would be developed by later scholars and transmitted to Europe. The word algebra itself derives from the title of one of al-Khwarizmi's works, demonstrating the lasting impact of Persian contributions to the development of mathematics. The intellectual synthesis achieved in the Islamic world during the Abbasid period represented a fusion of multiple traditions that produced something genuinely new and creative. The translation movement brought together Greek philosophy, Persian administration and science, Indian mathematics and medicine, and Arabic religious and linguistic traditions, creating a cultural environment in which scholars could draw on multiple sources to address new questions and solve new problems. The result was not simply the preservation of ancient knowledge but its transformation and extension through original research and creative synthesis. Islamic scholars made major contributions in fields ranging from mathematics and astronomy to medicine and philosophy, building on the foundations provided by the translation movement, while developing new methods and ideas. The intellectual achievements of this period laid the foundations for the subsequent development of science and philosophy in the Islamic world and, through the transmission of this knowledge to Europe, made significant contributions to the development of Western civilization. The Persian role in this intellectual synthesis was central, as Persian scholars, institutions, and traditions provided essential material and expertise that made the translation movement and its subsequent development possible. The legacy of Persian contributions to Islamic intellectual life extends far beyond the specific achievements of individual scholars to encompass the institutional and cultural frameworks that supported intellectual activity. The tradition of court patronage of learning, which had been well established in the Sassanian Empire, was adopted by Islamic rulers who saw the support of scholars and the accumulation of knowledge as essential to the dignity and power of their rule. The libraries, academies, and observatories that Islamic rulers established drew on Persian models and were often staffed by scholars of Persian origin. The tradition of encyclopedic scholarship, which sought to compile and organize knowledge in comprehensive works, had roots in Persian intellectual practice and became a distinctive feature of Islamic scholarship. The emphasis on the practical applications of knowledge, particularly in administration, medicine, and agriculture, reflected Persian traditions of statecraft that valued the useful arts. These institutional and cultural frameworks ensured that the intellectual achievements of the Abbasid period were not isolated accomplishments, but part of a continuing tradition of scholarship that would persist for centuries and spread throughout the Islamic world. The Shahnameh of Ferdowsi stands as the greatest literary monument of Persian cultural memory, preserving the history, legends, and values of pre-Islamic Iran within an Islamic framework that allowed this heritage to survive and flourish. Ferdowsi, who lived from approximately 940 to 1020, spent over 3 decades composing this massive epic poem of roughly 60,000 couplets, which narrates the history of Iran from the mythical first king Kayumars to the fall of the Sassanian Empire. The poem is organized around the reigns of 50 kings and emperors, divided into 3 major sections: the mythical age, the heroic age, and the historical age. The mythical age tells of the first kings and the establishment of civilization, while the heroic age, the longest and most beloved section, recounts the exploits of heroes such as Rostam, the greatest champion of Iranian legend. The historical age narrates the more recent history of the Achaemenid, Parthian, and Sassanian dynasties, drawing on historical traditions that had been preserved through oral transmission and written sources. Through this monumental work, Ferdowsi preserved the memory of Iran's ancient past in a form that could be embraced by subsequent generations of Iranians living within the Islamic world. The significance of the Shahnameh for Iranian cultural identity cannot be overstated, as the poem provided a literary foundation for Persian identity that was independent of religion and politics. Ferdowsi composed his epic at a time when the memory of pre-Islamic Iran was fading, as generations grew up knowing little of the kings and heroes who had ruled before the Arab conquest. The Shahnameh revived this memory, presenting the history of Iran as a continuous narrative that stretched from the beginning of time to the Islamic era. The poem celebrated the virtues of Iranian heroes and kings, including courage, justice, loyalty, and wisdom, presenting these virtues as the essential qualities of the Iranian character. The language of the Shahnameh, refined and elevated New Persian, established a standard for literary expression that would influence Persian literature for centuries. The poem's emphasis on the struggle between good and evil, with the Iranian heroes fighting against the forces of darkness and chaos represented by their enemies, provided a moral framework that resonated with both Zoroastrian and Islamic sensibilities. Through the Shahnameh, Ferdowsi gave the Iranian people a literary monument that preserved their cultural identity within an Islamic context. The story of Rostam, the greatest hero of the Shahnameh, has become one of the most beloved and influential narratives in Persian culture, embodying the values of courage, loyalty, and devotion to duty that the poem celebrates. Rostam, a warrior of superhuman strength and skill, serves as the champion of Iranian kings and the defender of the Iranian realm against all threats. His adventures, including his 7 labors, his battles against demons and enemies, and his tragic confrontation with his son Sohrab, are recounted in vivid detail that has captured the imagination of readers for 1,000 years. The tragedy of Rostam and Sohrab, in which the father unknowingly kills his own son in single combat, is one of the most moving episodes in world literature, exploring themes of fate, identity, and the tragic consequences of ignorance. Rostam's loyalty to the Iranian kings, even when they treat him unjustly, exemplifies the Persian ideal of devotion to the realm above personal interest. The character of Rostam has become a symbol of Iranian strength and virtue, celebrated in art, literature, and popular culture throughout the Persian-speaking world and beyond. The relationship between the Shahnameh and Islamic religion was complex and sometimes tense, as the poem celebrated pre-Islamic Iranian traditions that some pious Muslims viewed with suspicion. Ferdowsi was himself a Muslim, and the poem acknowledges Islam in various ways, but its primary focus is on the glories of the pre-Islamic past, which are presented in a positive light rather than condemned as ignorance and polytheism. This celebration of pre-Islamic heritage was controversial in some quarters, and Ferdowsi faced criticism for what some saw as excessive devotion to the ancient Iranian past. However, the Shahnameh was also widely embraced by Muslim rulers and audiences who saw no contradiction between Islamic faith and pride in Iranian heritage. The poem was copied, illustrated, and recited at courts throughout the Persian-speaking world, and its stories became part of the shared cultural heritage of Islamic civilization. The Shahnameh demonstrated that it was possible to be a devout Muslim and still celebrate the achievements of pre-Islamic Iranian civilization, providing a model of cultural identity that would prove enduring. The poem's integration of Iranian and Islamic elements created a synthesis that would shape Persian culture for centuries. The influence of the Shahnameh extended far beyond literature to shape the visual arts, performing arts, and popular culture of the Persian-speaking world. The epic stories provided subjects for countless miniature paintings, which depicted the exploits of Rostam and other heroes in vivid detail and established traditions of Persian painting that would flourish for centuries. The recitation of Shahnameh stories, known as Nakali, became a popular form of entertainment and cultural transmission, with storytellers performing episodes from the epic for audiences in coffee houses and at festivals. The heroes and villains of the Shahnameh became familiar figures in Persian art and iconography, appearing on everything from ceramics to textiles to architectural decoration. The values celebrated in the Shahnameh, including courage, loyalty, hospitality, and justice, became central to Persian cultural identity and influenced social norms and expectations. The poem's language and imagery permeated Persian culture, providing a shared vocabulary and symbolic framework that connected Iranians across regions and social classes. Through these multiple channels of influence, the Shahnameh became not just a literary work but a foundation of Persian cultural identity. The lasting legacy of the Shahnameh demonstrates the remarkable capacity of Persian culture to preserve its heritage through periods of profound change. Ferdowsi composed his epic at a time when the memory of pre-Islamic Iran was in danger of being lost, as the Arab conquest and the subsequent conversion to Islam had disrupted the transmission of Iranian cultural traditions. By committing the stories of Iranian kings and heroes to a monumental literary form, Ferdowsi ensured that this heritage would survive and continue to inspire future generations. The Shahnameh proved adaptable to changing circumstances, as subsequent generations found new meanings and applications for its stories within different political and cultural contexts. The poem remained a source of cultural pride and identity through the vicissitudes of Iranian history, including foreign conquests, dynastic changes, and religious transformations. The endurance of the Shahnameh as a cultural monument testifies to the resilience of Persian identity and the power of literature to preserve cultural memory across centuries. Through Ferdowsi's work, the ancient kings and heroes of Iran achieved a form of immortality, living on in the imagination of each new generation of readers and listeners. The concept of kingship in the Islamic world was profoundly shaped by Persian traditions of monarchy, creating a synthesis of Islamic religious legitimacy and Iranian imperial ideology that would influence political thought and practice for centuries. The Sassanian Empire had developed a sophisticated ideology of kingship that presented the ruler as the representative of God on earth, responsible for maintaining order, justice, and prosperity, and endowed with the divine charisma known as Far or Kvarina. This concept of sacred kingship, in which the ruler's authority derived ultimately from God and carried with it the obligation to rule justly, was transmitted to the Islamic world through Persian advisors, administrators, and literary works that preserved Iranian political wisdom. The Islamic concept of the caliph as the successor to the Prophet Muhammad and the leader of the Muslim community initially differed significantly from the Persian model of sacred kingship, as the early caliphs were chosen by the Muslim community and ruled with relatively little ceremony. However, as the Islamic state grew into a vast empire, Persian models of kingship became increasingly attractive to rulers who needed to project authority over diverse populations and maintain effective control over distant provinces. The transformation of Islamic rulership from the simple Arab tribal model of the early caliphs to the elaborate imperial model of the Abbasid period drew heavily on Persian precedents. The Abbasid caliphs, who established their capital at Baghdad in the heart of the former Sassanian territory, adopted many features of Persian court ceremony and protocol, including the seclusion of the ruler from ordinary people, the use of elaborate titles and honorifics, and the celebration of Persian festivals such as Nowruz. The caliph came to be seen as the shadow of God on earth, a phrase that echoed Persian concepts of the ruler as divine representative while remaining within the framework of Islamic theology. The institution of the wazir, or chief minister, which became central to Abbasid government, had roots in Sassanian administrative practice and was often held by men of Persian descent. The elaborate bureaucracy that developed under the Abbasids, with its multiple ministries and hierarchical organization, drew heavily on Sassanian models transmitted through Persian officials who served the Islamic State. This transformation of Islamic rulership created a model of monarchy that would be adopted by Islamic states throughout the medieval period. The figure of Khosrow I Anushirvan, the great Sassanian king who ruled from 531 to 579, became a model of just governance in Islamic literature, celebrated for his wisdom, justice, and effective administration. Khosrow I had reformed the Sassanian tax system, established a more centralized administration, and patronized learning and culture, earning a reputation as one of the greatest rulers in Iranian history. Islamic writers, both Arab and Persian, preserved and embellished stories about Khosrow's wisdom and justice, presenting him as an exemplar of good governance whose example should be followed by Muslim rulers. The image of Anushirvan the Just, as he was known in Islamic literature, combined elements of Iranian tradition with Islamic values, creating a model of kingship that was both culturally Persian and religiously acceptable. Works of political advice, known as Mirrors for Princes, drew on the example of Khosrow and other Iranian kings to teach Muslim rulers the principles of effective and just governance. The popularity of these works demonstrates the continuing relevance of Persian political wisdom in the Islamic world and the successful integration of Iranian concepts of kingship into Islamic political thought. The genre of advice literature, known as Mirrors for Princes, represented one of the most important channels through which Persian political wisdom was transmitted to the Islamic world. These works, written in both Arabic and Persian, offered guidance to rulers on how to govern effectively and justly, drawing on examples from Iranian history and traditions of political thought. The works emphasized the importance of justice as the foundation of stable rule, warning that rulers who oppressed their subjects would lose divine favor and eventually their thrones. They stressed the need for rulers to surround themselves with wise advisors, to maintain effective systems of taxation and administration, and to patronize learning and culture. Many of these works drew explicitly on Sassanian sources, preserving and adapting Iranian political wisdom for Islamic audiences. The most famous of these works, the Ctesiphon written by the Ziyarid prince Kaykavis in the 11th century, and the Siyasat-Nama written by the Seljuk vizier Nizam al-Mulk, drew heavily on Persian traditions of political thought while addressing the concerns of Islamic rulers. These works became widely read and influential throughout the Islamic world, shaping the way rulers understood their responsibilities and the way subjects expected to be governed. The Persian influence on Islamic concepts of justice and governance extended beyond the realm of political theory to shape actual administrative practice and legal institutions. The Sassanian emphasis on the ruler's responsibility to protect the weak and ensure justice for all subjects was incorporated into Islamic political thought, influencing the development of institutions such as the Mazlim courts, where subjects could appeal against abuses of power by officials. The Persian tradition of administrative regulation, with its detailed rules for taxation, land management, and official conduct, influenced the development of Islamic administrative law and practice. The concept of the ruler as the guardian of prosperity, responsible for maintaining irrigation systems, roads, and other infrastructure essential to economic well-being, drew on Persian traditions of imperial governance. These practical influences ensured that the Persian contribution to Islamic political culture was not merely theoretical but shaped the everyday experience of government for millions of subjects of Islamic states. The synthesis of Persian and Islamic concepts of governance created a political culture that was distinctive and enduring, influencing the development of states throughout the Islamic world. The legacy of Persian concepts of kingship in the Islamic world demonstrates the capacity of political ideas to survive the collapse of the political structures that originally produced them. The Sassanian Empire fell in the 7th century, but the ideas about rulership, justice, and governance that it had developed continued to influence political thought and practice in the Islamic world for centuries. Persian advisors and administrators transmitted these ideas to the new Islamic state, where they were adapted to fit Islamic theological and legal frameworks. Literary works preserved and disseminated Persian political wisdom, making it available to rulers and officials throughout the Islamic world. The result was a synthesis of Persian and Islamic political traditions that created a distinctive model of rulership, combining the Islamic emphasis on religious legitimacy with the Persian emphasis on justice and effective administration. This synthesis would shape the political culture of the Islamic world for centuries, influencing everything from the organization of government to the expectations that subjects had of their rulers. The survival and adaptation of Persian political ideas demonstrate that the Islamic conquest of Iran was not simply a replacement of one political culture by another but rather a creative synthesis that produced something genuinely new. The revolts and political movements that swept through the Iranian world in the 8th and 9th centuries played a crucial role in shaping the relationship between Persian identity and Islamic rule, creating patterns of resistance and accommodation that would influence subsequent history. These movements arose from a complex mixture of grievances, including resentment of Arab domination, opposition to heavy taxation, dissatisfaction with the centralizing policies of the Abbasid state, and attachment to pre-Islamic Iranian religious traditions. The leaders of these movements often combined Islamic ideology with Persian cultural elements, creating syncretic belief systems that appealed to populations caught between their Iranian heritage and their new Islamic faith. The Abbasid Revolution itself, which had mobilized Persian support against the Umayyad Caliphate, demonstrated the political potential of movements that combined Persian identity with Islamic legitimacy. However, once the Abbasids were in power, they faced challenges from other movements that sought to continue the revolutionary impulse or to establish alternative forms of political and religious authority. The study of these movements reveals the contested nature of Islamic rule in Iran and the creative ways in which Iranians sought to define their place within the Islamic world. The movement of Bahafarid, which emerged in Khorasan in the 740s, illustrates the syncretic religious experimentation that characterized the early Islamic period in Iran. Bahafarid was a Zoroastrian who claimed to have received a new revelation, combining elements of Zoroastrianism with Islamic practices and teachings. He criticized the Zoroastrian priesthood for corruption and called for reforms in religious practice, while also incorporating Islamic elements such as daily prayers and opposition to alcohol. His movement attracted followers among the rural population of Khorasan, who were attracted by his message of religious reform and social justice. The Zoroastrian hierarchy, threatened by Bahafarid's criticism, denounced him to the Muslim authorities, who suppressed the movement and executed Bahafarid. The movement of Bahafarid demonstrates the religious fluidity of early Islamic Iran, as individuals and communities experimented with new combinations of religious ideas drawn from multiple traditions. This experimentation was possible because the process of conversion to Islam was gradual and incomplete, leaving space for alternative religious developments that challenged both Zoroastrian orthodoxy and Islamic orthodoxy. The movement of al-Mukanna, who led a major revolt in Transoxiana from 776 to 783, represents a more radical challenge to both Islamic and Zoroastrian orthodoxy. Al-Mukanna, known as the Veiled Prophet of Khorasan, claimed to be an incarnation of the divine and attracted followers who believed he possessed supernatural powers. His movement combined elements of Islamic eschatology with Iranian religious traditions, creating a revolutionary ideology that challenged the legitimacy of the Abbasid state and the Islamic religious hierarchy. Al-Mukanna's followers, known as the White-Clothed Ones, fought against Abbasid forces for several years before being defeated. The movement attracted support from various groups, including former followers of Abu Muslim and those who resented Arab domination and Abbasid centralization. The Veiled Prophet's revolt demonstrates the continuing appeal of revolutionary movements that combine political opposition with religious innovation, and the difficulty that the Abbasid state faced in establishing its authority over the eastern provinces of the empire. The movement also illustrates the persistence of pre-Islamic Iranian religious ideas within an Islamic framework, as al-Mukanna's claims of divine incarnation echoed ancient Iranian concepts of divine kingship. The Kermite movement, which challenged Abbasid authority in Azerbaijan and northwestern Iran from the late 8th century through the 9th century, represented the longest-lasting and most widespread of these syncretic religious and political movements. The Kermites traced their spiritual lineage to Abu Muslim, the leader of the Abbasid Revolution who had been executed by the Caliph al-Mansur, and to the Mazdakite movement that had challenged Sassanian orthodoxy in the 6th century. They rejected many Islamic practices, including circumcision and dietary restrictions, and maintained a form of religious practice that combined elements of Zoroastrianism, Mazdakism, and Islam. The Kermite leader Babak, who led the movement from 816 to 837, established a stronghold in the mountains of Azerbaijan and successfully resisted Abbasid armies for over 2 decades. Babak's movement attracted widespread support among the rural population, who saw in it a challenge to both Arab domination and the exploitation of the Abbasid state. The eventual defeat of Babak in 837 marked the end of organized Kermite resistance, but the movement's ideas and memory persisted in the region, influencing later developments in Iranian religious and political thought. The Kermite movement demonstrates the depth of resistance to Islamic orthodoxy in some regions of Iran and the persistence of pre-Islamic Iranian religious traditions within an Islamic context. The relationship between these syncretic movements and the broader process of Islamization in Iran is complex and has been interpreted in different ways by scholars. Some scholars have argued that these movements represented a transitional phase in the conversion of Iranians to Islam, as populations that had broken with Zoroastrian orthodoxy but were not yet ready to accept Orthodox Islam gravitated toward alternative religious movements. According to this interpretation, the defeat of these syncretic movements by Abbasid forces left their followers with no alternative but to accept Orthodox Islam, accelerating the process of conversion. Other scholars have emphasized the political dimensions of these movements, seeing them primarily as expressions of resistance to Arab domination and Abbasid centralization rather than as religious developments. Both interpretations capture important aspects of the phenomenon, as the movements combined religious innovation with political opposition in ways that were characteristic of the period. What is clear is that these movements played a significant role in the transformation of Iranian society, serving as vehicles for the expression of grievances and the exploration of new forms of religious and political identity. The legacy of these revolts and movements can be seen in the continuing influence of their ideas and symbols on Iranian political and religious culture. The figure of Abu Muslim, executed by the caliph he had helped to power, became a symbol of Persian resistance to Arab domination and a focus of popular devotion for centuries. The memory of Babak and the Kermite movement persisted in popular culture, celebrated as an example of resistance to foreign rule. The syncretic religious traditions of these movements contributed to the development of distinctive forms of Islamic practice in Iran, including forms of Sufism that incorporated elements of pre-Islamic Iranian spirituality. The political challenge that these movements posed to Abbasid authority contributed to the decentralization of the Islamic State and the emergence of autonomous Persian dynasties in the eastern provinces. The revolts and movements of the 8th and 9th centuries thus played a crucial role in shaping the development of Persian Islamic identity, creating patterns of resistance and accommodation that would continue to influence Iranian political and religious life for centuries. The emergence of Persian dynasties in the Eastern Islamic world during the 9th and 10th centuries represented a crucial phase in the development of Persian Islamic identity, as these dynasties created political spaces within which Persian culture could flourish and Persian identity could be expressed in new ways. The Tahirid dynasty, founded by Tahir ibn Hussein in 821, established the first autonomous Persian state in the Islamic world, ruling Khorasan and surrounding regions while acknowledging Abbasid suzerainty. The Tahirids were descendants of Persian aristocrats who had converted to Islam and risen through the Abbasid administration, and their rule represented the integration of Persian elites into the Islamic political order. The Safarid dynasty, founded by Yaqub ibn al-Layth in 861, represented a more populist assertion of Persian identity, as Yaqub rose from humble origins as a coppersmith to challenge both the Tahirids and the Abbasid Caliphate. The Samanid dynasty, which ruled Khorasan and Transoxiana from 819 to 999, represented the fullest expression of Persian cultural revival within an Islamic framework, as the Samanids patronized Persian literature, promoted Persian administration, and celebrated their Iranian heritage. Together, these dynasties transformed the political landscape of the Eastern Islamic world and created conditions for the flourishing of Persian culture. The Samanid dynasty, in particular, played a crucial role in the revival of Persian language and literature, creating a cultural environment that would produce some of the greatest works of Persian literature. The Samanids claimed descent from the Sassanian nobleman Bahram Chobin, establishing a genealogical connection to the pre-Islamic Persian past that legitimized their rule in Iranian terms. Their capital at Bokhara became a major center of Persian culture, attracting poets, scholars, and artists from throughout the Eastern Islamic world. The Samanid court was conducted in Persian, and the dynasty actively promoted the development of new Persian literature as a medium for expressing Iranian identity within an Islamic context. The poet Radaki, who served at the Samanid court, composed the first major works of new Persian poetry, establishing literary forms that would be developed by later poets such as Ferdowsi. The Samanid period also saw the production of important works in Persian prose, including historical works that preserved the memory of the pre-Islamic Iranian past. The Samanid achievement demonstrated that it was possible to be both fully Muslim and fully Persian, and their example would be followed by subsequent dynasties throughout the Islamic world. The development of Persian administration under these dynasties represented a revival and adaptation of Sassanian administrative traditions within an Islamic framework. The Samanid state was organized along lines that reflected both Islamic principles and Persian administrative traditions, with a complex bureaucracy that managed taxation, land registration, and correspondence. The office of the vizier, which had roots in Sassanian administration and had been developed further under the Abbasids, became central to Samanid government, with Persian viziers exercising significant power and influence. The Samanid administrative system was admired throughout the Islamic world and served as a model for subsequent Islamic states, including the Ghaznavid and Seljuk empires. The use of Persian as an administrative language, alongside Arabic, represented a significant development in the relationship between the two languages and the emergence of a distinctly Persian form of Islamic governance. This administrative tradition would prove influential far beyond the Samanid period, shaping the development of government throughout the Persianate world for centuries. The patronage of learning and culture by these Persian dynasties created conditions for the flourishing of Islamic scholarship and the development of distinctive Persian contributions to Islamic civilization. The Samanid court at Bokhara attracted scholars from throughout the Islamic world, including the great physician and philosopher Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, who served the Samanid dynasty before moving on to other patrons. Ibn Sina's works, which synthesized Greek philosophy with Islamic theology and made major contributions to medicine, represented the highest achievements of Islamic scholarship and demonstrated the intellectual vitality of the Persianate world. The Samanid period also saw the development of Persian historiography, as scholars such as Balami wrote historical works in Persian that preserved the memory of Iranian and Islamic history for Persian-speaking audiences. The patronage of these dynasties created an environment in which Persian scholars could make major contributions to Islamic civilization while maintaining their distinctive cultural identity. The intellectual achievements of the Samanid period laid the foundations for the subsequent development of Persianate Islamic culture throughout the region. The political and cultural achievements of these Persian dynasties had implications that extended far beyond their own territories, as they established patterns of Persianate Islamic rule that would be adopted and adapted by subsequent dynasties throughout the Islamic world. The Ghaznavid dynasty, which succeeded the Samanids in the Eastern Islamic world, continued the Samanid tradition of Persian cultural patronage while expanding their empire into India. The Seljuk dynasty, which conquered much of the Middle East in the 11th century, adopted Persian administrative practices and patronized Persian literature, even as they maintained their Turkish military traditions. The model of Persianate Islamic rule that emerged from the experience of these dynasties combined Islamic religious legitimacy with Persian cultural prestige, creating a synthesis that would shape the political and cultural development of the Islamic world for centuries. This Persianate model of Islamic civilization extended far beyond the borders of Iran, influencing the development of Islamic societies from Anatolia to India to Central Asia. The achievements of the Tahirid, Safarid, and Samanid dynasties thus represented not merely a regional development, but a fundamental transformation of Islamic civilization. The emergence of Persian dynasties in the Eastern Islamic world also had important implications for the relationship between Persian identity and Islamic religion, as these dynasties demonstrated that it was possible to be both proud of Iranian heritage and fully committed to Islam. The Samanid rulers, in particular, saw no contradiction between their Islamic faith and their celebration of Persian culture, patronizing both Islamic scholarship and Persian literature. This synthesis of Iranian and Islamic identity would become characteristic of Persianate Islamic civilization, as subsequent generations of rulers and scholars followed the Samanid example. The development of Persian literature, including the Shahnameh of Ferdowsi, provided a cultural foundation for this synthesis, preserving the memory of pre-Islamic Iran while embracing Islam as the religion of the present. The result was a form of Islamic civilization that was distinctly Persian in its cultural expression, while remaining fully committed to Islamic religious principles. This Persianate Islamic civilization would prove remarkably enduring, surviving political changes, foreign conquests, and religious developments to remain a major force in the Islamic world to the present day. The Sufi tradition in the Iranian world developed into one of the most influential and distinctive expressions of Islamic spirituality, combining Islamic mystical teachings with Persian cultural sensibilities to create a form of religious practice that would spread throughout the Islamic world and beyond. The term Sufism derives from the Arabic word suf, meaning wool, referring to the rough woolen garments worn by early Muslim ascetics who renounced worldly comforts in pursuit of spiritual purification. This ascetic tradition, which emerged in the early Islamic period, found particularly fertile ground in the Iranian world, where it absorbed elements of Persian cultural and religious sensibility while remaining firmly rooted in Islamic doctrine and practice. The development of Sufism in Iran was shaped by a complex interplay of factors, including the continuing influence of pre-Islamic Iranian spiritual traditions, the social and political circumstances of Persian Muslims under Islamic rule, and the creative contributions of individual mystics and teachers who developed new forms of spiritual practice and teaching. The result was a distinctive style of Islamic spirituality that emphasized inner experience, divine love, and the transformation of the soul, and that produced some of the greatest mystical literature in world history. The great Persian Sufi masters of the medieval period developed sophisticated systems of spiritual practice and teaching that became foundational for Sufism throughout the Islamic world. Bayezid Bastami, who lived in the 9th century, was one of the earliest and most influential of these masters, known for his ecstatic utterances that described experiences of union with God and language that challenged conventional religious categories. His famous exclamation, "Glory be to me! How great is my majesty!" expressed the experience of the complete annihilation of the self and God that would become a central theme of Sufi mysticism. Abu al-Hasan al-Karakani, who lived in the 10th and 11th centuries, continued this tradition of ecstatic mysticism while also emphasizing the importance of humility and service to others. His saying, "I have become nothing, God has become everything," captured the essence of the Sufi path of self-annihilation. Abu Said ibn Abi al-Khair, who lived in the 11th century, developed the institutional framework of the Sufi lodge, known as the Kanaka, which became the primary institution for the transmission of Sufi teachings and the organization of Sufi communities. These early masters established patterns of spiritual practice and teaching that would shape the development of Sufism for centuries. The poetry of Persian Sufism represents one of the highest achievements of Islamic literature, expressing profound spiritual truths in a language of beauty, passion, and symbolic imagery that has continued to inspire readers for centuries. The great Persian Sufi poets, including Sanai, Attar, Rumi, and Hafiz, used the forms and imagery of Persian love poetry to express the soul's longing for God, creating a body of literature that combined extraordinary artistic beauty with profound spiritual insight. Attar, who lived in the 12th and 13th centuries, composed the Conference of the Birds, an allegorical poem that describes the journey of a group of birds in search of their king, the Simurgh, as a metaphor for the soul's journey to God. Rumi, who lived in the 13th century, composed the Masnavi, a massive work of spiritual teaching that has been called the Quran in Persian, exploring themes of divine love, spiritual transformation, and the relationship between the human soul and God through stories, parables, and direct spiritual instruction. Hafiz, who lived in the 14th century, composed ghazals, short lyric poems, that expressed the complexities of spiritual experience in language of extraordinary beauty and ambiguity. These poets created a literary tradition that would influence not only Persian literature but also Turkish, Urdu, and other Islamic literatures. The organizational structure of Sufism developed in the Iranian world through the establishment of Sufi orders, known as tariqas, which provided institutional frameworks for the transmission of spiritual teachings and the organization of spiritual communities. The orders were organized around the teachings of a particular master, known as the Sheikh or Pir, and his successors, who transmitted the master's spiritual authority and teachings through a chain of initiation known as the Silsila. The Sufi Lodge, or Kanaka, served as a center for spiritual practice, teaching, and community life, providing a space where disciples could receive instruction, participate in communal rituals, and pursue their spiritual development under the guidance of the master. The orders developed distinctive practices and rituals, including forms of remembrance of God, known as daikar, that involved recitation, meditation, and sometimes music and movement. The development of these institutional structures allowed Sufism to spread throughout the Islamic world and to reach all levels of society, from the intellectual elite to the common people. The Sufi orders became among the most important institutions of Islamic religious life, complementing and sometimes challenging the authority of the formal religious scholars known as the ulama. The relationship between Sufism and pre-Islamic Iranian religious traditions has been the subject of considerable scholarly debate, with some scholars arguing for significant continuity between Zoroastrian concepts and Persian Sufi ideas. While direct influence is difficult to demonstrate conclusively, there are notable parallels between certain Zoroastrian concepts and Sufi teachings that suggest a shared cultural sensibility. The Zoroastrian emphasis on the struggle between good and evil, with the individual called upon to choose the side of good, has parallels in the Sufi emphasis on the struggle against the lower self, known as the nafs, and the cultivation of virtue. The Zoroastrian reverence for light as a symbol of divine presence has echoes in the Sufi use of light imagery to describe spiritual illumination and the experience of divine presence. The Zoroastrian concept of the individual's responsibility for their actions and the judgment of souls after death has parallels in Sufi teachings about spiritual accountability and the soul's journey after death. These parallels do not indicate that Sufism is simply a continuation of Zoroastrianism, as Sufi teachings are firmly rooted in Islamic doctrine and practice, but they do suggest that Persian cultural sensibilities shaped the way Sufism developed in the Iranian world and contributed to its distinctive character. The spread of Sufism throughout the Islamic world represents one of the most important channels through which Persian cultural influence extended beyond the borders of Iran, as Sufi masters of Persian origin or training carried their teachings to distant regions and established communities that transmitted Persian language, literature, and cultural values along with Islamic spiritual teachings. The poetry of Persian Sufis such as Rumi, Hafiz, and Attar became widely known and admired throughout the Islamic world, influencing the development of Turkish, Urdu, and other Islamic literatures. The Sufi orders that originated in the Iranian world established networks that span the Islamic world, creating connections between distant regions and facilitating the movement of ideas, people, and goods. This Persian cultural influence through Sufism was particularly important in the spread of Islam to new regions, as Sufi missionaries carried not only Islamic teachings but also Persian cultural forms that enriched the religious and cultural life of the communities they touched. The result was the creation of a Persianate Islamic culture that extended far beyond the borders of Iran and that would have profound consequences for the history of the entire region. The emergence of the Persianate world represents one of the most significant developments in the history of Islamic civilization, as Persian culture, language, and political traditions spread far beyond the borders of Iran to shape the development of Islamic societies from Anatolia to India. The term Persianate refers to a cultural sphere in which Persian language and literary traditions served as the primary medium of high culture, regardless of the ethnic origins or native languages of the rulers and populations within that sphere. This Persianate world emerged gradually over the course of the medieval period, as Persian dynasties such as the Sassanids established models of Persianate Islamic rule that were adopted by subsequent dynasties, including Turkish and Mongol rulers who conquered much of the Islamic world. The spread of Persianate culture was facilitated by the prestige of Persian literature, particularly the poetry of Ferdowsi, Rumi, and other great Persian writers, which was admired and imitated throughout the Islamic world. The result was a cultural synthesis that combined Islamic religion, Persian language and literature, and diverse local traditions to create a distinctive civilization that would shape the history of the Middle East, Central Asia, and South Asia for centuries. The adoption of Persian language and literary traditions by non-Persian dynasties represents one of the most remarkable features of the Persianate world, as rulers of Turkish, Mongol, and other origins embraced Persian as the language of court, administration, and high culture. The Ghaznavid dynasty, founded by Turkish military commanders in the late 10th century, adopted Persian as the language of their court and patronized Persian literature, even as they maintained their Turkish military traditions. The Seljuk dynasty, which conquered much of the Middle East in the 11th century, similarly adopted Persian administrative practices and patronized Persian literature, establishing a model of Turkish rule that was culturally Persianate. The Mongol Ilkhanid dynasty, which ruled Iran in the 13th and 14th centuries, adopted Persian as the language of administration and patronized Persian literature and art, even as they maintained connections to the wider Mongol world. The Timurid dynasty, founded by the Central Asian conqueror Timur in the 14th century, presided over a brilliant flowering of Persianate culture, patronizing poets, artists, and scholars who created some of the greatest works of Persian art and literature. This pattern of non-Persian rulers embracing Persian culture demonstrates the prestige and influence of Persianate civilization. The development of Persian historiography represents an important dimension of Persianate culture, as historians writing in Persian preserve the memory of dynasties, events, and cultural achievements for Persian-speaking audiences throughout the Islamic world. The tradition of Persian historical writing began in the Samanid period with works such as the translation of al-Tabari's Universal History into Persian by Balami, which made the history of the Islamic world available to Persian-speaking audiences. Subsequent historians, including Bayhaqi, Juvaini, and Rashid al-Din, produced major works of Persian historiography that combined careful research with literary elegance and served as models for historical writing throughout the Persianate world. These historians wrote for patrons who valued the preservation of memory and the celebration of dynastic achievements, and their works provide invaluable sources for understanding the political and cultural history of the medieval Islamic world. The tradition of Persian historiography continued to develop over the centuries, producing works of great sophistication and scope that documented the history of the Persianate world from its origins to the modern period. This tradition demonstrates the central role of Persian language and literary culture in the intellectual life of the Persianate world. The spread of Persianate culture to India represents one of the most significant and enduring legacies of the Persianate world, as Persian language and literary traditions became deeply embedded in the political and cultural life of the Indian subcontinent. The Ghaznavid and Ghurid conquests of northern India in the 11th and 12th centuries brought Persian-speaking rulers and administrators to the subcontinent, establishing Persian as the language of government and high culture. The Delhi Sultanate, which ruled much of northern India from the 13th to the 16th centuries, was thoroughly Persianate in its culture, with Persian serving as the language of administration and literary expression. The Mughal Empire, which ruled most of India from the 16th to the 18th centuries, continued and extended this Persianate tradition, patronizing Persian literature and using Persian as the language of government. The influence of Persian on Indian languages, particularly Urdu, which emerged as a synthesis of Persian and local Indian languages, demonstrates the depth of Persianate cultural influence in the subcontinent. The Persianate tradition in India produced major works of literature, history, and philosophy that contributed to the development of a distinctive Indo-Persian culture that would have lasting consequences for the region. The art and architecture of the Persianate world represented a distinctive visual culture that combined Islamic religious principles with Persian aesthetic traditions and local artistic practices. Persian miniature painting, which developed in the medieval period, created a distinctive visual language that combined the flat, decorative qualities of Persian art with the religious and literary themes of Islamic culture. The great illustrated manuscripts of Persian literature, including copies of the Shahnameh and the works of Persian poets, represented major achievements of Persianate art, combining the skills of calligraphers, painters, and bookbinders to create objects of extraordinary beauty. Persian architecture, with its characteristic features such as the Iwan, the dome, and the use of tile decoration, influenced the development of Islamic architecture throughout the Persianate world, from the mosques of Iran to the mausoleums of Central Asia to the palaces of Mughal India. The architectural achievements of the Persianate world, including the great mosques of Isfahan, the mausoleums of Samarkand, and the Taj Mahal in Agra, demonstrate the enduring influence of Persian aesthetic traditions on the built environment of the Islamic world. This visual culture served as a powerful medium for the transmission of Persianate values and identity across the vast territories of the Persianate world. The legacy of the Persianate world extends to the present day, as Persian language and literary traditions continue to shape the cultural life of a vast region stretching from the Middle East to South Asia. Persian remains a major language of literature and scholarship in Iran, Afghanistan, and Tajikistan, and the classical Persian literary tradition continues to be studied and admired throughout the region. The influence of Persian on other languages, including Turkish, Urdu, and other languages of the Islamic world, testifies to the enduring impact of Persianate civilization. The cultural patterns established during the medieval period, including the synthesis of Islamic religion with Persian literary and cultural traditions, continue to shape the identity and self-understanding of communities throughout the Persianate world. The history of the Persianate world thus represents not merely a historical period but a continuing cultural tradition that has shaped the development of a significant portion of humanity. The emergence of this Persianate world from the crucible of the Islamic conquest of Iran represents one of the most remarkable examples of cultural transformation and resilience in world history. The slow transition through which Islam assimilated the Persian soul represents one of the most significant transformations in world history, a process that took centuries and produced a civilization that was neither simply Persian nor simply Islamic but something entirely new. The Arab conquest of the Sassanian Empire in the 7th century was a dramatic political event that brought an end to a dynasty that had ruled the Iranian plateau for over 4 centuries. However, the conquest did not bring an end to Persian culture, institutions, or identity, which proved remarkably resilient and adaptable in the face of profound religious and political change. The Persian people did not simply disappear into the Arab-Muslim population but instead maintained their distinctive cultural identity while gradually adopting Islam as their religion. This dual process of religious conversion and cultural persistence created a complex and dynamic civilization that would have profound consequences for the history of the entire region. The story of this transformation is not one of simple replacement or simple continuity but rather of creative synthesis, as Persian and Islamic elements combine to produce new forms of culture, politics, and spirituality. The gradual nature of the conversion of Iranians to Islam is crucial to understanding the character of the civilization that emerged from this process. Unlike some historical conquests that resulted in rapid and complete religious transformation, the Islamization of Iran occurred over several centuries, with Zoroastrian communities persisting in many regions long after the political conquest was complete. This gradual conversion allowed for a process of cultural negotiation and adaptation, as Iranians found ways to maintain elements of their cultural identity while embracing the new religion. The result was a form of Islam that was deeply influenced by Persian cultural sensibilities, from the administrative practices of the Islamic State to the spiritual practices of Persian Sufism. The survival of Zoroastrian communities in Iran to the present day, particularly in Yazd and Kerman, testifies to the incompleteness of the conversion process and the tolerance that Islamic rulers sometimes showed toward religious minorities. The gradual nature of conversion also meant that each generation experienced only modest changes in their religious and cultural environment, allowing for a smoother transition than would have been possible with more rapid change. The Persian contribution to Islamic civilization was so extensive that it is impossible to imagine Islamic history without it. Persian administrators developed the bureaucratic systems that allowed the Islamic State to govern its vast territories. Persian scholars made fundamental contributions to the development of Islamic science, medicine, mathematics, and philosophy, and Persian poets created a literary tradition that enriched the cultural life of the Islamic world for centuries. The concept of kingship that developed in the Islamic world drew heavily on Persian models, as did the court ceremonies and administrative practices of Islamic rulers. The Sufi tradition, which became one of the most widespread and influential forms of Islamic spirituality, found particularly fertile ground in the Iranian world and produced some of the greatest mystical teachers and poets in Islamic history. The Persian language, transformed by its encounter with Arabic, emerged as one of the major literary languages of the Islamic world, serving as the medium for a rich tradition of poetry, history, and scholarship. This Persian contribution to Islamic civilization demonstrates that the relationship between conquerors and conquered in the Islamic world was far more complex than simple domination, involving significant cultural exchange and mutual influence. The emergence of the Persianate world, a cultural sphere in which Persian language and literary traditions served as the primary medium of high culture, represents one of the most significant legacies of the Islamic assimilation of Persia. This Persianate world extended far beyond the borders of Iran, encompassing Anatolia, Central Asia, and India, and shaping the development of Islamic civilization in these regions for centuries. Dynasties of Turkish, Mongol, and other origins adopted Persian as the language of court and administration, patronized Persian literature and art, and embraced Persian models of kingship and governance. The result was a cultural synthesis that combined Islamic religion, Persian language and literary traditions, and diverse local elements to create a distinctive civilization that would shape the history of a vast region. The Persianate world produced some of the greatest achievements of Islamic civilization, from the poetry of Rumi and Hafiz to the architecture of Isfahan and the Taj Mahal, demonstrating the creative potential of cultural synthesis. The legacy of this Persianate world continues to shape the cultural life of the region to the present day, as Persian language and literary traditions continue to be studied and admired throughout the Middle East and South Asia. The survival and transformation of Persian cultural identity through the Islamic period represents a remarkable example of cultural resilience in world history. The Persians lost their empire, their dynasty, and their state religion, but they did not lose their cultural identity, which adapted to new circumstances and found new forms of expression within the Islamic world. The Shahnameh of Ferdowsi preserved the memory of pre-Islamic Iranian kings and heroes in a literary form that could be embraced within an Islamic context. The Persian language, transformed by the adoption of the Arabic script and the incorporation of Arabic vocabulary, remained a vital medium of expression for Iranian identity. Persian concepts of kingship, justice, and governance were adapted to Islamic political thought and practice. Persian aesthetic traditions shaped the development of Islamic art and architecture. Through these and other channels, the Persian cultural heritage was transmitted to new generations and new regions, ensuring its survival and continued relevance. The ability of Persian culture to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining its distinctive identity demonstrates the resilience of cultural traditions in the face of political and religious change. The story of how Islam assimilated the Persian soul is ultimately a story of transformation on both sides. The Persians were transformed by their adoption of Islam, which brought a new religion, a new language of scholarship, and a new political order. But Islam was also transformed by its encounter with Persian civilization, which contributed administrative practices, political concepts, cultural forms, and spiritual sensibilities that enriched the Islamic tradition. The result was a civilization that was neither simply Arab nor simply Persian but something new, a synthesis that combined the religious vision of Islam with the cultural heritage of Persia to create a distinctive form of Islamic civilization. This synthesis would prove remarkably enduring, surviving political changes, foreign conquests, and religious developments to remain a major force in the Islamic world to the present day. The Persian soul, which survived the fall of the Sassanian Empire and the conversion of Iran to Islam, found new expression within Islamic civilization, contributing to its development and enriching its culture. The story of this transformation demonstrates the complex ways in which civilizations interact and evolve, as conquerors and conquered alike are shaped by their encounter with each other. The Islamic world that emerged from this encounter was far richer and more diverse than it would have been without the Persian contribution, testifying to the creative potential of cultural exchange. I hope you enjoyed this content, and I'll see you in the next video.